My name is Natalie Reynolds, and at 32 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a courtroom facing my own sister. Miranda's face remained emotionless as the judge reviewed her lawsuit demanding $3,000 monthly payments for emotional damages I'd supposedly caused since childhood. When Judge Harrison finally looked up from the papers, the courtroom fell silent. "In my 20 years on the bench," he said, "I've never seen such a blatant attempt to monetize family resentment." But that was just the beginning of my nightmare. If you've ever had a family member turn on you when money was involved, you know exactly how my stomach dropped that day in court. I still remember gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. Before I share how this nightmare with my sister unfolded, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments. I'm curious how far this family drama will travel. And if you've ever dealt with toxic family members, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone in this struggle. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, our family looked perfectly normal from the outside. My father, Robert, worked as an accountant at a respectable firm, bringing home a steady income that kept us comfortable in our modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My mother, Diana, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, beloved by her students and respected by other parents. To neighbors and friends, the Reynolds family exemplified middle-class stability and success. But inside our home, the dynamics were far more complicated, especially between my sister Miranda and me. With our 4-year age gap, Miranda was already establishing herself as the family star by the time I was forming my earliest memories. At 8 years old, she was winning spelling bees and playing violin in recitals while I was just learning to read. By 12, she was captain of the debate team and earning straight A's while I struggled with basic math concepts. Miranda has such natural talent. My mother would tell her friends over coffee in our kitchen, loud enough for me to hear from the living room where I'd be drawing or reading. Some children just have that special something from birth. I remember one particular parent-teacher conference when I was 9. My teacher had praised my creativity and how I'd helped organize a class project. On the drive home, I waited for my parents to acknowledge the positive feedback, but they spent the entire ride discussing Miranda's upcoming regional science fair competition instead. When I finally mentioned my teacher's comments, my father glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "That's nice, Natalie. Maybe someday you'll accomplish something significant like your sister." Their favoritism manifested in countless ways. For Miranda's 16th birthday, my parents surprised her with a used car. Nothing fancy, but it was freedom on 4 wheels. When my 16th birthday arrived, I received driving lessons and occasional permission to borrow my mother's car for essential trips only. Christmas gifts followed the same pattern. Miranda would unwrap a laptop or expensive clothes while I received practical items like socks or school supplies. Family vacations became exercises in catering to Miranda's preferences. If she wanted to visit San Francisco because it would look good on college applications to tour the prestigious universities there, that's where we went. My suggestion to visit the Oregon coast, just a few hours away, was dismissed as lacking ambition. The summer I turned 15, things between Miranda and me deteriorated from simple favoritism to active antagonism. She had just graduated high school as valedictorian and was preparing for her freshman year at Stanford with a partial scholarship. I made the mistake of confiding in her about my crush on a boy named Thomas from my science class. 2 days later, I overheard a group of girls in the hallway laughing about desperate Natalie, who allegedly wrote Thomas a pathetic love letter. When I confronted Miranda about the rumor, she simply shrugged. "Maybe if you weren't so obvious about drooling over him, people wouldn't talk," she said, not even bothering to deny her role in spreading the gossip. That same year, Miranda borrowed my favorite sweater without asking, the only expensive clothing item I owned, a birthday gift from our grandmother Grace. She returned it with a large coffee stain down the front. "Sorry," she said without a trace of remorse. "It wasn't really your style anyway." When I complained to our parents, my mother sighed. "Natalie, don't be so materialistic. It's just a sweater. Miranda has her college interviews coming up. She has real things to worry about." By the time I reached high school, I had developed significant anxiety and self-esteem issues. While Miranda thrived in the spotlight, I shrank into the background, convinced that nothing I did would ever measure up. I stopped sharing my achievements or dreams with my family, knowing they would be measured against Miranda's, and found wanting. The only person who seemed to see me as an individual worth celebrating was our grandmother Grace, my father's mother. A retired librarian with a sharp mind and warm heart, Grandma Grace lived alone in a charming two-story craftsman home about 20 minutes from us. While my parents attended every one of Miranda's events, I often spent weekends with Grandma Grace, helping in her garden or baking in her kitchen. "You have a special gift for seeing beauty in ordinary things, Natalie," she told me once as we planted tulip bulbs in her front yard. "That's rare and valuable, even if some people don't recognize it yet." When I brought home a B+ on an art project that had taken weeks of effort, my parents barely glanced at it. But Grandma Grace asked me to explain every detail, then insisted on hanging it on her living room wall. "Your perspective is unique," she said, stepping back to admire my landscape painting. "Never try to be like anyone else, especially not your sister." I was 17 when Grandma Grace had her first stroke. It wasn't severe, but it scared all of us. I still remember the hospital room, sterile and bright, with Grandma looking smaller than usual against the white sheets. Miranda came for a brief visit, chatting about her college experiences before checking her watch and leaving for a study group. I stayed until visiting hours ended, holding Grandma's hand and reading to her from her favorite poetry book. As she recovered, something shifted in Grandma Grace's eyes when she looked at our family, a new awareness of dynamics she perhaps hadn't fully recognized before. She began watching more carefully how my parents interacted with each of us, and I sometimes caught a frown crossing her face during family gatherings. "Remember, Natalie," she told me privately after a particularly difficult Thanksgiving where my parents had spent the entire meal praising Miranda's internship opportunities, "true worth isn't measured by achievements or attention." Some people learn that lesson too late. I didn't understand the weight of her words then, or how prophetic they would prove to be in the years that followed. Fast forward 10 years, and the patterns established in our childhood had only calcified in our adult lives. At 28, I was working as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm in Portland. The pay wasn't great, but I enjoyed the creative challenges and had gradually built a modest portfolio of work I was proud of. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a developing area of the city. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and I decorated it with secondhand furniture and my own artwork. Miranda, now 32, had become exactly what our parents had groomed her to be, successful by conventional standards. After graduating from Stanford and then Yale Law, she had secured a position at a prestigious corporate law firm. She married Richard Chambers, a business consultant from a wealthy family, and they purchased a stunning craftsman home in Portland Heights, one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. Their wedding had been featured in a local lifestyle magazine, with my parents beaming proudly in every photo. "Your sister certainly knows how to build a life," my mother commented during one of our infrequent phone calls. "Their home has 5 bedrooms, planning ahead for children, of course. Smart girl." The implied comparison to my studio apartment and single status hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. The favoritism that had defined our childhood continued unabated in adulthood. When Miranda and Richard were house hunting, my parents contributed $50,000 toward their down payment, an investment in family legacy, as my father called it. 6 months later, when I approached them about a $5,000 loan to take a specialized design course that could advance my career, their response was swift. "We're not in a position to fund hobbies, Natalie," my father said. "Maybe focus on finding a more stable career path first." Holiday gatherings became showcases for Miranda's accomplishments, her latest big case, Richard's new business ventures, their luxury vacation to the Maldives. My contributions to these conversations, a new client I was excited about or an art installation I'd visited, were met with polite nods before the subject quickly returned to Miranda. Throughout these years, Grandma Grace's health had been gradually declining. At 82, she had experienced a second, more serious stroke that left her with limited mobility on her right side. She insisted on remaining in her home rather than moving to an assisted living facility, which meant she needed regular help with daily tasks. I took on the responsibility of checking on her several times a week. Despite my busy work schedule, I would visit after office hours to help with dinner, organize her medications, or simply provide company. On weekends, I'd tackle bigger tasks: grocery shopping, cleaning, laundry, and yard maintenance. The additional responsibilities strained my already tight budget: gas for the extra driving, picking up groceries she needed, occasionally missing work for doctor appointments. But I never considered it a burden. Grandma Grace and I would sit in her sunroom, drinking tea as she shared stories from her youth or asked thoughtful questions about my design projects. She kept a folder of my work, from childhood drawings to professional designs, and would flip through it proudly when her friends visited. "My Natalie sees the world differently," she would tell them. "That's a gift." Miranda's visits to Grandma were rare and brief. She would arrive in her luxury SUV, usually with an expensive gift, gourmet chocolates or a cashmere throw, spend 30 minutes updating Grandma on her professional triumphs, then check her watch and apologize for having to rush off to some important meeting or dinner reservation. Despite this obvious disparity in caregiving, my parents continued to praise Miranda's generosity toward Grandma. Miranda brought her that lovely throw blanket from Nordstrom my mother mentioned on one of her infrequent visits. Wasn't that thoughtful? And so busy with her caseload, yet she makes time. I bit my tongue rather than pointing out who actually adjusted Grandma's medications, took her to medical appointments, and ensured she ate properly every day. As Grandma's health became more fragile, she began confiding in me about her disappointment in Miranda's absence and my parents' blindness to it. "They only see what they want to see," she told me one evening as I helped her into bed. "Always have. But I see everything, Natalie. The little things you do that no one notices. Those are the true measure of love." It was during this period that I met James Foster through a mutual friend at an art gallery opening. A software engineer with kind eyes and an easy laugh, James quickly became a source of stability in my increasingly complicated life. Unlike previous boyfriends who grew frustrated with my family obligations, James often accompanied me on visits to Grandma, charming her with his genuine interest in her stories and willingly helping with household repairs she needed. "Your family dynamic is..." He searched for a diplomatic word after witnessing a particularly uncomfortable Sunday dinner where my parents had spent the entire meal fawning over Miranda's latest promotion. "Toxic," I suggested. I was going to say challenging, but yeah, toxic works too. He squeezed my hand under the table. "You know you don't have to accept being treated this way, right?" Before James, I had never considered that I could establish boundaries with my family. Their treatment had seemed normal, or at least inevitable. But through his outside perspective, I began to see how unhealthy our family patterns truly were. The turning point came at Grandma Grace's 85th birthday celebration. I had spent weeks planning a small gathering at her home, arranging for her favorite foods, inviting her few remaining friends, and creating a photo album chronicling her life. Miranda arrived 45 minutes late, interrupting Grandma's friend Helen mid-story to present an expensive silver picture frame. "It's Tiffany," she announced loudly, as if the brand name added sentimental value. When it came time for Grandma to say a few words, she reached for my hand. "I want to thank you all for coming today," she said, her voice frail but clear. "But most of all, I want to thank my Natalie, while others bring me lovely gifts now and then." She glanced briefly at Miranda. "Natalie gives me the most precious gift of all, her time and her heart, day after day. That's the true meaning of family." The room fell silent. Miranda's face flushed dark red, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass. My parents shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that mixed confusion and irritation. James, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand supportively. Later, as guests were leaving, I overheard Miranda talking to our mother in the kitchen. "She's clearly getting confused," Miranda said dismissively. "As if Natalie's occasional visits compare to the financial support I provide." "Did you see that cheap photo album? I could have had a professional one made if she'd mentioned it." "Your grandmother has always had a soft spot for underdogs," my mother replied. "Don't take it personally, dear." I stepped away before they could see me, a strange mix of vindication and sadness washing over me. For perhaps the first time, I had been publicly acknowledged in my family, and it had only highlighted how deep the divisions between us truly ran. Grandma Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 months after her birthday celebration. I was with her the night before, having stopped by after work as usual to help her prepare for bed. She seemed tired but in good spirits, reminiscing about a summer vacation from her childhood. Her last words to me were, "You're the heart of this family, Natalie. Never forget that." The next morning, her home health aide found her. The call came while I was at work, and I rushed to her house, tears blurring my vision as I drove. By the time I arrived, my parents were already there, and Miranda pulled up in her Audi just minutes later, still dressed in her courtroom attire. "I had to reschedule a client meeting," she announced as she strode through the door, as if this sacrifice deserved special recognition. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, which Miranda quickly took control of. "I know people at the finest funeral home in Portland," she declared, overriding my suggestion to use the modest local place Grandma had mentioned preferring. "Grandma deserves the best, and I'm happy to contribute financially." The implication that I couldn't afford to give Grandma a proper funeral hung in the air. I focused instead on the personal touches, selecting Grandma's favorite hymns, gathering photos for the memorial display, and writing a heartfelt eulogy that had many guests in tears. Miranda spoke as well, her polished delivery impressive, but somehow missing the essence of who Grandma truly was. A week after the funeral, we gathered at Grandma's attorney's office for the reading of the will. Mr. Peterson, a kind-faced man in his 60s who had been Grandma's friend and legal advisor for decades, greeted us solemnly. "Before we begin," he said, "Grace wanted me to tell you that her decisions were made with clear mind and careful consideration." This unusual preface raised my parents' eyebrows, and Miranda shifted impatiently in her seat. "Let's proceed," my father said. "We all understand that Grace was of sound mind." I noticed the slight emphasis on sound mind, as if my father was preemptively defending against any suggestion of cognitive decline, a defense that hadn't yet been challenged. It struck me as odd, but I was too grief-stricken to dwell on it. Mr. Peterson began reading the formal legal language of the will, and I found my mind wandering to memories of Grandma's garden, her laugh, the way she always smelled faintly of lavender and Earl Grey tea. I was startled back to attention when I heard my name. "To my granddaughter Natalie Reynolds, I leave my home at 1847 Maple Street, Portland, Oregon, and its entire contents, with the exception of items specifically designated below. I also leave to Natalie the sum of $250,000 for my savings, with the hope that she will use it to pursue her artistic passions and create the stable future she deserves." The room fell silent. I felt as if all the air had been sucked out, leaving me unable to breathe or think. Miranda's face had gone completely still, like a porcelain mask with only her eyes showing any life, and what blazed there was pure fury. "To my granddaughter Miranda Reynolds Chambers, I leave my collection of jewelry, including my engagement ring, wedding band, pearl necklace, and all items in the blue velvet box in my bedroom dresser. These pieces have witnessed a century of our family's history and should be treasured accordingly." Mr. Peterson paused, looking up from the document. "The jewelry collection has been appraised at approximately $30,000. "This is ridiculous," Miranda snapped, breaking the tense silence. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," Mr. Peterson replied calmly. "Grace amended her will 6 months ago, after her second stroke. I personally verified her competence, as did her physician." "6 months ago," my father repeated, his gaze shifting to me with sudden suspicion. "Around the time Natalie was spending so much time with her." "She was manipulated," Miranda declared, standing up abruptly. "This will is a fraud." Mr. Peterson reached for another envelope. Grace anticipated this reaction and left a personal letter explaining her decisions. Would you like me to read it? Yes, I whispered, as Miranda simultaneously said, that won't be necessary. Mr. Peterson opened the letter anyway. My dear family, he read, if you're hearing this letter, then decisions I've made may have caused hurt feelings. That was never my intention. I've chosen to leave my home and the majority of my financial assets to Natalie not because I loved Miranda less, but because I've observed the patterns in our family over many years. Miranda has received tremendous advantages, support, and financial assistance throughout her life. She has a successful career, a wealthy husband, and parents who have consistently prioritized her needs and dreams. Natalie, meanwhile, has shown me the true meaning of family through her consistent care, love, and presence, often at significant personal cost. This inheritance is not only a thank you for her years of selfless care, but an attempt to balance scales that have been unfairly weighted for too long. The jewelry I've left to Miranda represents our family history and the elegant strength she embodies. I hope she will treasure these pieces and remember that true value isn't always measured in dollars. With eternal love, Grace Reynolds. Miranda's face had transformed during the reading, flushing deep red before settling into a cold, hard expression I had never seen before. So that's it, she said, her voice eerily controlled. She spent her final years turning you against me, and you were happy to help her do it. That's not what happened, I protested. I never. Save it, Miranda snapped. You've been jealous of me your entire life, and you finally found a way to get back at me. Congratulations. I hope the money brings you joy. My parents sat in stunned silence, my mother's hand pressed against her mouth, my father's face unreadable. Miranda, please, I said, tears welling in my eyes. This isn't about you or me. It's about what Grandma wanted. What she wanted after you poisoned her mind against her successful granddaughter, Miranda retorted. How convenient that she changed her will while you were playing devoted caregiver. She turned to our parents. Are you going to say anything? Your youngest daughter just stole $500,000 from our family. My father cleared his throat. Natalie, your grandmother was elderly and vulnerable. Did you suggest these changes to her? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No. I had no idea about any of this. Grandma never discussed her will with me. It's awfully coincidental, my mother said quietly. All those private hours with her, and suddenly the will changes dramatically in your favor. I looked from face to face, realizing with a sinking heart that all three of them truly believed I had somehow manipulated Grandma Grace for financial gain. The thought was so absurd, so contrary to everything I valued, that I couldn't even formulate a defense. Perhaps I should mention, Mr. Peterson interjected, that Grace specifically instructed me not to use Natalie as a witness for the will changes precisely to avoid these kinds of accusations. The witnesses were myself and Dr. Harriet Coleman, who had no connection to either granddaughter. This information did nothing to soften the hostility radiating from my family. As we left the attorney's office, James was waiting for me in the parking lot. One look at my face told him everything he needed to know. That bad? He asked, pulling me into a hug. Worse, I whispered against his shoulder. They think I manipulated Grandma to get her money. Over the next few weeks, the conflict only escalated. Miranda launched a campaign of character assassination among our extended family and mutual acquaintances. Suddenly, cousins who had always been friendly became distant. My Aunt Susan called to ask if the rumors were true that I had prevented Miranda from visiting Grandma during her final months, an absurd accusation given Miranda's consistently voluntary absence. At family gatherings, which became increasingly tense affairs, Miranda would make cutting remarks about elder abuse and fortune hunters. My parents, while not openly hostile, made their position clear through their silence and failure to defend me. James, witnessing my distress, suggested I offer a compromise to keep the peace. You could offer to split some of the assets with Miranda, he proposed one evening as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at yet another hostile text message from my sister. Not because you have to, but because it might put an end to this nightmare. Though I knew I had done nothing wrong, I decided to try this approach. I called Miranda and suggested meeting at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. To my surprise, she agreed. "I want to propose a compromise," I said after we'd settled at a corner table, her with a black coffee, me with a chai latte I was too nervous to drink. "I know Grandma's decision hurt you, and that wasn't my intention or hers. What if I sold the house and split the proceeds with you? We could each keep the specific items she left us, but share the major assets." Miranda studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That's your idea of a compromise? Giving me less than half of what should have been rightfully mine?" "I'm trying to find a solution that honors Grandma's wishes while acknowledging your feelings," I explained. "My feelings?" Miranda's voice rose slightly, causing a nearby patron to glance our way. "This isn't about feelings, Natalie. This is about justice. You manipulated an elderly woman and stole my inheritance." "That's not true," I insisted, feeling my own temper rising. "I spent time with Grandma because I loved her, not because I wanted anything from her." "Save the innocent act," Miranda said coldly. "I've already spoken to our family lawyer. The will can be contested on grounds of undue influence, and with Mom and Dad's testimony about your suspicious behavior, I have a strong case." I felt the blood drain from my face. There was no suspicious behavior. I took care of our grandmother when no one else would. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Miranda's smile was razor-sharp. "We'll see what a judge has to say about it." 2 days later, Mr. Peterson called to inform me that Miranda had indeed filed a formal legal challenge to the will. When I asked him how concerned I should be, his side told me everything. "Grace did everything by the book, and her wishes were clear," he said. "But will contests can be unpredictable, and they always get ugly. Be prepared for your family relationships to suffer, regardless of the legal outcome." What I didn't know then was that Richard, Miranda's husband, had suggested an alternative strategy that would prove far more destructive than a simple will contest. My last attempt at family reconciliation came 3 weeks after Grandma's death, when my parents invited both Miranda and me to dinner at their home. I arrived hopeful that perhaps they had come to their senses and wanted to mediate peace between their daughters. That hope died quickly when I realized it was an ambush. Miranda was already there when I arrived, sitting at the dining table with my parents flanking her like protective guards. The conversation started civilly enough, with my mother serving her famous pot roast and my father discussing a documentary he'd recently watched. Just as I began to relax slightly, Miranda set down her fork and looked directly at me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our childhood and the patterns that led us here," she began, her voice eerily calm. "And I've come to recognize the extent of the damage you've caused me over the years." "Damage?" I repeated, confused. "Psychological and emotional damage," she clarified. "Living in the shadow of your manipulation and resentment has taken a significant toll on my mental health. My therapist has helped me see how your constant undermining affected my self-esteem and relationship capabilities." I looked to my parents, expecting them to recognize the absurdity of this claim, but they were nodding along with sympathetic expressions. "Miranda has been seeing Dr. Levine for anxiety related to family trauma," my mother explained. "He's one of the top psychologists in Portland." "What family trauma?" I asked, completely bewildered. Miranda was the golden child. She got everything she ever wanted. "That's your narrative," Miranda countered smoothly. "My reality was living with a sister who resented me and actively worked to damage my relationships, culminating in turning my own grandmother against me in her vulnerable final years." The conversation devolved from there, with Miranda listing grievances so twisted from reality that I barely recognized the events she described. According to her version, I had deliberately sabotaged her school projects, poisoned her relationships, and isolated Grandma Grace to manipulate her. When I finally stood up, unable to tolerate any more of this alternate reality, Miranda delivered her final blow. "My lawyer will be contacting you," she said calmly. "I'm suing you for emotional damages, $3,000 monthly compensation for the ongoing trauma you've caused." I stared at her, certain this must be some kind of a sick joke. You can't be serious. Dead serious, Miranda replied. And given Mom and Dad's willingness to testify about your behavior, I'd say my chances are excellent. I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me, who should have known better than anyone who I truly was. You're supporting this? My father cleared his throat. We love both our daughters, but we can't ignore the evidence of Miranda's suffering. Her therapist has documented significant trauma. I left their house in tears, calling James from my car because I was shaking too hard to drive safely. As he held me in the passenger seat of my parked car, I realized a fundamental truth. The family I had known was gone, if it had ever truly existed at all. The formal lawsuit notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a court courier who seemed embarrassed by his task. The thick envelope contained page after page of legal language, but the essence was clear. Miranda Reynolds Chambers was suing me, Natalie Reynolds, for intentional infliction of emotional distress and demanding $3,000 monthly payments for life as compensation. Additionally, she was requesting that the court overturn Grandma's will and award her the house and half of the monetary inheritance. The allegations were so outlandish that I might have laughed if I wasn't so terrified. According to the lawsuit, I had engaged in a lifelong campaign of psychological warfare against Miranda, causing her severe anxiety, depression, and inability to form healthy attachments. The document cited incidents throughout our childhood that were either completely fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. After reading the first few pages, I felt my chest tightening, the familiar sensation of a panic attack building. I slid down against my apartment wall, the papers scattered around me, trying to remember the breathing techniques my own therapist had taught me years ago. Therapy I had sought to deal with the anxiety of growing up as the forgotten child in my family, ironically enough. James found me there an hour later when he stopped by on his lunch break, having grown concerned when I didn't respond to his texts. He took one look at the legal documents and immediately called his friend Susan Campbell, an attorney who specialized in family law. "This is the most ridiculous lawsuit I've seen in years," Susan declared after reviewing the papers in her small office downtown the next day. Unfortunately, ridiculous doesn't mean harmless. Family lawsuits like this can be dangerous precisely because they're so emotional. "Do I need to worry about her winning?" I asked, my voice small. Susan removed her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "On merit?
No.
This is frivolous. But judges can be unpredictable with family matters, and Miranda is clearly willing to go to extreme lengths. Plus, she's a lawyer with a lawyer husband and probably has friends in the legal community. We need to take this seriously." The next few weeks were a crash course in the legal system as we entered the discovery phase of the lawsuit. Miranda's legal team, led by her husband Richard, requested everything from my childhood diaries to email correspondence with Grandma Grace to financial records showing how I had spent money on her care. More disturbing were the exhibits Miranda submitted as evidence of my alleged psychological abuse. These included excerpts from her childhood diary, selectively edited to make innocuous interactions sound sinister. A typical entry read, "Natalie was watching me practice piano again today. She's always lurking, probably jealous because she can't play." The entry failed to mention that I had been 9 years old at the time, and my mother had assigned me to the living room to do homework while Miranda practiced. Photographs from family events that had been subtly manipulated, shadows darkened around my eyes to make me appear to be glaring, images cropped to make it seem like I was excluding Miranda. Written statements from my parents detailing times when I had allegedly undermined Miranda, such as deliberately scheduling a school art show the same evening as Miranda's debate championship or intentionally breaking Miranda's science project the night before it was due. The reality that the art show date had been set by the school, not me, and that I had accidentally bumped into Miranda's project while carrying groceries was nowhere mentioned. Most disturbing were the medical records Miranda submitted, showing therapy sessions for anxiety and depression that she claimed were directly caused by my campaign of emotional terrorism. Her therapist, Dr. Levine, had provided a statement supporting the connection between her mental health struggles and my alleged behavior. How can a professional therapist make these claims without ever speaking to me? I asked Susan during one of our preparation meetings. Unfortunately, therapists can only work with the information their clients provide, Susan explained. If Miranda has been telling Dr. Levine these stories for years, he may genuinely believe them. We'll need to challenge his conclusions during cross-examination. The financial and emotional strain of defending myself began affecting every aspect of my life. I was distracted at work, missing deadlines and submitting designs that lacked my usual creativity. My manager, while sympathetic to my family issues, warned that my job could be at risk if my performance didn't improve. Sleep became elusive, and when I did manage to drift off, I had nightmares about being imprisoned for crimes I hadn't committed or finding myself penniless and abandoned. The inheritance from Grandma, money that should have represented freedom and opportunity, remained untouched in a separate account as Susan advised, a tangible reminder of how quickly blessings can become burdens. Throughout this ordeal, James remained my steadfast support. He took on extra freelance coding projects to help cover our mounting legal expenses, accompanied me to every meeting with Susan, and held me through the night terrors that became increasingly frequent. "You're the strongest person I know," he told me one evening as we sat on my small balcony, watching the sunset over the Portland skyline. "Most people would have crumbled under this pressure." "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "I feel like I'm barely holding on." He took my hand, and I noticed he seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "Maybe this isn't the right time with everything going on, but—" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But I've realized there is no perfect moment. There's just us, facing life together." Inside the box was a simple but beautiful ring with a small emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my grandmother's," James explained. "She was an artist too, a pianist. She would have loved you." Through tears, I accepted his proposal, finding a moment of pure joy amid the chaos that had become my life. We agreed to keep our engagement private for now, not wanting to give Miranda additional ammunition or create a spectacle during the ongoing legal battle. Our brief happiness was interrupted the next morning when I discovered that someone had posted one-star reviews of my design work on several professional platforms, using language that closely mirrored Miranda's lawsuit allegations about my deceptive nature and manipulative tendencies. Though the reviews used pseudonyms, the timing and specific wording made the source obvious. When I told Susan about this development, she advised documenting everything but not responding directly. "This kind of harassment actually helps our case," she explained. "It shows the court who's really engaging in a campaign of emotional distress." Things escalated further when Miranda began contacting my clients directly. Two of them called me, confused and concerned, saying they had received emails warning them about my unethical business practices and ongoing legal issues. One client, a small local bakery I had designed branding materials for, decided to pause our working relationship until your personal matters are resolved. The final straw came when Miranda showed up at my workplace unannounced, asking to speak to my manager about concerns regarding an employee. Fortunately, my manager recognized her from photos I had shown him and refused the meeting, but the incident left me shaken and embarrassed. "She's trying to destroy every aspect of your life," James said that evening, his usual calm demeanor giving way to anger. "This goes beyond the inheritance or even the lawsuit. She wants to see you ruined." As we prepared for the upcoming trial, an unexpected development occurred. While sorting through the last of Grandma Grace's personal papers that I had brought to my apartment, I discovered a hidden journal tucked between her old tax returns. The small leather-bound book contained entries from the last 3 years of her life, documenting her thoughts about family dynamics and her growing concern about Miranda's behavior. One entry particularly stood out. "Miranda visited today after 6 months of silence. Spent the entire time talking about her new kitchen renovation, then asked pointed questions about my will. When I changed the subject, she became visibly irritated. Left after 30 minutes, taking the photo album of Robert's childhood that I'd specifically asked her not to touch. Claimed she wanted to digitize the photos for safekeeping. I fear her interest in me extends only to what she can gain materially." Even more revealing was a memory card taped to the final page of the journal with a note, record of Miranda's true nature, for safekeeping. When James and I viewed the contents on my laptop, we were shocked to find video recordings taken from what appeared to be a small camera hidden in Grandma Grace's living room. In one clip, Miranda could be clearly seen rifling through Grandma's desk drawers while Grandma was in the bathroom. In another, more damning video, Miranda was having a phone conversation while Grandma napped in her bedroom. "No, I'm stuck at the old lady's house again," Miranda said to the unseen caller. "Mom's on my case about family duty." As if visiting this decaying house once a month isn't torture enough. She laughed at something the other person said. "Yeah, well, at least there's a decent inheritance waiting at the end of this tedious road. The house alone is worth $500,000 in this market. I've already got plans for renovating it once it's mine, if she ever kicks the bucket." I felt physically ill watching the footage, not just because of Miranda's callousness, but because it confirmed what I had suspected but never wanted to believe. My sister saw Grandma Grace as nothing more than a path to financial gain. When I showed the journal and videos to Susan, she was cautiously optimistic. "This is compelling evidence of Miranda's true motivations," she acknowledged. "But using it means exposing your grandmother's private thoughts and actions to public scrutiny. It would be effective, but are you comfortable with that?" I struggled with the ethical implications. Grandma Grace had been a private person who valued dignity above all else. Would she want her secret recordings and intimate thoughts displayed in court, even to defend me? "What if we hold this in reserve?" I suggested. "Use it only if absolutely necessary?" Susan nodded. "A sound strategy. Let's see how Miranda's case unfolds before deciding." The pretrial hearing arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering glow. Judge Harrison, a stern-looking man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, reviewed the case materials with an unreadable expression. Richard presented Miranda's case with polished confidence, weaving a narrative of my alleged psychological warfare with the skill of someone who knew how to make fiction sound factual. Miranda took the stand briefly, giving tearful testimony about her years of suffering at my hands. When Susan presented our defense, focusing on the lack of concrete evidence and the suspicious timing of Miranda's claims, I could see a flicker of skepticism cross Judge Harrison's face. However, he ultimately decided to allow the case to proceed to a full hearing. "The court takes allegations of familial emotional distress seriously," he stated. "While I have reservations about certain aspects of this case, Mrs. Chambers has presented sufficient cause for a full examination of the facts." As we left the courthouse, I noticed a reporter from a local news blog taking notes. By that evening, a story had appeared online with the attention-grabbing headline, "Sister Sues Sister. The price tag on family emotional damage." The article was relatively balanced but included quotes from Miranda about seeking justice for years of hidden abuse. "Great," I muttered to James as we read the article on my laptop. "Now I'm a public villain too." What had begun as a private family dispute was spiraling into a public spectacle. But as my initial shock and hurt gave way to determination, I found myself growing stronger. Years of being the family doormat had conditioned me to back down, to accept blame, to prioritize peace over justice. But with Grandma Grace's inheritance, James's unwavering support, and the increasingly obvious malice behind Miranda's actions, something fundamental shifted within me. I had spent my life avoiding conflict, particularly with my family. Now, facing the destruction of my reputation, career, and financial future, I finally found the resolve to stand and fight. "I'm done being her victim," I told James that night, a newfound steel in my voice. "If Miranda wants a war, she's going to discover I'm not the pushover she thinks I am." As this feeling of resolve washed over me, I couldn't help but think about how far I'd come. If you've ever had to find your strength in the middle of a storm, you know exactly what I was feeling in that moment. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, I truly believed I could win this fight. Have you ever had to stand up to a family bully? Let me know in the comments. Your stories help remind all of us we're not alone in these struggles. The morning of the trial arrived with an unseasonable chill for Portland in spring. A light drizzle fell as I stood on the courthouse steps with James and Susan, watching local news vans set up their equipment. Our family drama had caught the attention of several media outlets, framed as a cautionary tale about inheritance disputes and sibling rivalry. Remember, Susan reminded me as we prepared to enter, stay calm no matter what Miranda or her witnesses say. Judge Harrison strikes me as someone who values emotional control. Miranda arrived moments later, stepping out of Richard's black BMW in an outfit that looked like it had been carefully selected to project vulnerability, a modest gray dress with minimal jewelry and subtle makeup that emphasized the shadows under her eyes. The performance continued as Richard guided her up the steps with a protective arm around her shoulders, as if she might collapse without his support. By contrast, I had opted for simple honesty in my appearance, a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, minimal makeup. James squeezed my hand reassuringly as we followed Susan into the courtroom. Judge Harrison entered promptly at 9, his demeanor as stern as I remembered from the pre-trial hearing. After preliminary instructions, Richard called Miranda as their first witness. On the stand, Miranda painted a picture of our childhood that I barely recognized. According to her tearful testimony, I had been a master manipulator from an early age, deliberately sabotaging her achievements and undermining her self-confidence through subtle psychological warfare. Natalie always knew how to make me feel worthless without anyone else noticing, Miranda claimed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She would whisper things when no one else could hear, like, they only love you for what you achieve, or without your grades, you'd be nothing to them. I stared at her in disbelief. These conversations had never happened. In fact, the dynamic had been entirely reversed, with Miranda frequently reminding me of my lesser status in the family. Can you describe specific incidents of this alleged psychological abuse? Richard prompted, his tone gentle as if speaking to a fragile victim. Miranda proceeded to describe incidents throughout our childhood, each one twisted from reality. How I had deliberately spilled juice on her valedictorian speech the night before graduation. In reality, it had been an accident for which I had profusely apologized. How I had intentionally scheduled a date to the same restaurant where she was celebrating an anniversary with Richard to spy on them. A complete fabrication. How I had manipulated Grandma Grace by telling her Miranda was too busy to visit, when Miranda had genuinely been too busy, by her own choice. The most painful betrayal, Miranda continued, her voice breaking, was watching Natalie systematically turn our grandmother against me during her vulnerable final years. Grandma and I had always been close, but suddenly she became cold and distant toward me. When I confronted Natalie about it, she just smiled and said, "Grandma finally sees you for who you really are." I gripped the edge of our table so hard my knuckles turned white. That conversation had never happened. Susan placed a warning hand on my arm, reminding me to maintain composure. "And how has this affected you emotionally and psychologically?" Richard asked. "I've been in therapy for years," Miranda replied, her voice small.
Dr.
Levine diagnosed me with anxiety and depression directly stemming from the emotional abuse I suffered. I have trust issues that affect my marriage, panic attacks before family gatherings, and persistent nightmares about being humiliated and devalued. She looked directly at me for the first time. The inheritance was just the final blow, proof that Natalie had succeeded in turning the person I loved most against me. When Richard concluded his questioning, Susan approached for a cross-examination. "Mrs. Chambers," she began, her tone respectful but firm, "you've described a pattern of abuse that spans decades, yet there are no witnesses to these interactions, no documentation from the time these events allegedly occurred, and no intervention from your parents or other adults. Is that correct?" "The abuse was subtle," Miranda insisted. "Natalie was careful to only show her true nature when we were alone. So there's no one who can corroborate these specific incidents." "My parents witnessed the effects," Miranda replied. "The effects, but not the causes," Susan clarified. Let's discuss the inheritance from your grandmother. Prior to her death, how often did you visit Grace Reynolds during the last year of her life? Miranda shifted uncomfortably. I was extremely busy with my career. I visited when I could. According to Grace's home health aides records, you visited 3 times in the 12 months preceding her death. Is that accurate? I called frequently, Miranda countered defensively. Phone records indicate 2 calls in that same period, Susan noted, referring to documents in her hand. Meanwhile, Natalie visited approximately 4 times weekly and called daily. Does that sound accurate? Natalie didn't have the demanding career I did, Miranda replied, an edge creeping into her voice. She had the luxury of time. Natalie worked full-time while providing care for your grandmother, Susan corrected. She spent approximately 20 hours weekly on caregiving duties in addition to her 40-hour work week. Would you characterize that as having the luxury of time? As the cross-examination continued, Susan methodically highlighted the inconsistencies in Miranda's testimony, from the timeline of alleged incidents to the lack of contemporaneous evidence. By the time Miranda stepped down, her composed victim persona had developed noticeable cracks, with flashes of irritation breaking through her carefully maintained facade. My parents testified next, their accounts supporting Miranda's version of events while carefully avoiding any specific incidents they had personally witnessed. Under Susan's cross-examination, they were forced to admit they had never actually seen me engage in the behaviors Miranda described. So your belief that Natalie psychologically abused Miranda is based entirely on what Miranda told you? Susan asked my father. We could see the effects, he insisted. Miranda would be upset after spending time with Natalie. Did you ever consider there might be other explanations for that distress? Like what? My father asked, genuinely puzzled. Like the possibility that Miranda was upset by the natural consequences of her own actions or choices? Susan suggested. My father's expression hardened. Miranda has always been our responsible, achievement-oriented child. Natalie has always been different. The way he said different, as if it were a synonym for defective, cut deep, but it also revealed volumes about the family dynamic that had shaped both Miranda and me. After lunch recess, it was my turn to testify. Susan had prepared me thoroughly, emphasizing the importance of sticking to facts rather than emotions, no matter how provocative Miranda's allegations had been. I described our childhood from my perspective, Miranda as the golden child, me as the forgotten one. The consistent pattern of favoritism from our parents, my genuine relationship with Grandma Grace based on shared interests and mutual affection rather than any attempt to secure an inheritance. Did you ever engage in the behaviors your sister described? Susan asked. Never, I stated firmly. Our relationship was difficult, but I never deliberately tried to hurt Miranda or undermine her. If anything, I spent most of my childhood trying to gain the approval my parents so freely gave her. When Richard cross-examined me, his approach was aggressive, clearly designed to provoke an emotional response that would undermine my credibility. Isn't it true that you resented your sister's success? He demanded. I resented the unequal treatment we received, I clarified. Not her achievements themselves. And that resentment motivated you to turn your grandmother against her, didn't it? I never turned Grandma against Miranda, I replied evenly. Grandma formed her own opinions based on Miranda's actions, or lack thereof. Convenient that those opinions resulted in you receiving the bulk of a substantial inheritance, Richard observed with a smirk. I was as surprised by Grandma as well as everyone else, I responded. I never discussed inheritance with her, or expected to be the primary beneficiary. Despite Richard's best efforts, I maintained my composure throughout the grueling cross-examination. When I finally stepped down, James gave me a subtle thumbs up from his seat in the gallery. The trial took an unexpected turn when Susan called our next witness, Dr. Matthew Cohen, a family therapist Miranda had consulted briefly 5 years earlier, before beginning treatment with Dr. Levine. Objection. Richard immediately stood. Any communication between my client and Dr. Cohen is protected by therapist-patient confidentiality. Your Honor, Susan countered. Mrs. Chambers waived that confidentiality when she put her mental health at issue in this lawsuit and submitted Dr. Levine's records and testimony. Furthermore, she signed a general release of her mental health records as part of the discovery process, which includes Dr. Cohen's records. Judge Harrison reviewed the release forms briefly. Objection overruled. The witness may testify. Miranda's face had gone pale, and she was whispering urgently to Richard. It was the first time I had seen genuine fear in her expression. Dr. Cohen, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, explained that Miranda had consulted him for 6 sessions 5 years ago but had discontinued treatment when he suggested approaches that didn't align with her expectations. Can you share with the court what Mrs. Chambers discussed regarding her relationship with her sister during these sessions?
Susan asked.
Mrs. Chambers expressed significant resentment toward her sister, Dr. Cohen testified, not because of any abuse, but because she perceived that her sister had a more genuine relationship with their grandmother. She specifically stated, and I quote from my notes, "Grandma Grace sees something special in Natalie that she doesn't see in me, and it drives me crazy. I'm the successful one. I should be her favorite." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Miranda's hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Did Mrs. Chambers ever mention plans regarding her grandmother's inheritance? Susan continued. She expressed concern that her grandmother might leave significant assets to Natalie. When I asked why this worried her, given her own financial success, she said, and again I quote, "It's not about needing the money. It's about winning. Natalie has taken enough from me already. She doesn't get to take Grandma's money too." And did Mrs. Chambers ever mention psychological abuse from her sister? No, Dr. Cohen stated firmly. The dynamic she described was one of jealousy on her part, not abuse from her sister. When I suggested we explore her feelings of inadequacy despite her objective successes, she terminated treatment. Miranda suddenly stood up. "He's lying. This is all lies." "Mrs. Chambers, control yourself," Judge Harrison warned. "Another outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." Richard managed to calm Miranda, but the damage was done. Her mask of composed victimhood had shattered, revealing the raw anger beneath. The final devastating testimony came from Lydia Martinez, Miranda's former legal assistant who had left the firm under unclear circumstances the previous year. Lydia testified that Miranda had openly discussed plans to sue me regardless of the inheritance outcome. She said, and these were her exact words, "I'm going to teach Natalie a lesson she'll never forget," Lydia recalled. She instructed me to research cases involving emotional distress claims between family members, specifically looking for the highest damage awards. Lydia also testified that Miranda had asked her to help compile financial records that would conceal her true financial situation from the court. Mrs. Chambers and her husband have investment accounts totaling over $2 million, Lydia revealed. She specifically directed me to omit those from any financial disclosures related to this case. By the time all testimony concluded, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a case about my alleged psychological abuse of Miranda had transformed into a revealing examination of Miranda's manipulation and vindictiveness. In his closing argument, Richard tried valiantly to redirect focus to Miranda's emotional suffering, but the effort fell flat against the weight of the contradictory evidence. Susan's closing emphasized the lack of evidence for Miranda's claims and the substantial evidence of her true motivations. This case, Susan concluded, is not about emotional damage inflicted by Natalie Reynolds. It's about Miranda Chambers' inability to accept that her grandmother saw through the facade and made an independent decision about her estate. It's about a lifetime of privilege colliding with the reality that some things, like genuine care and love, cannot be purchased or manipulated into existence. Judge Harrison announced he would take one day to consider his ruling before delivering his judgment. As we filed out of the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of Miranda's face. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid, not of me, but of the consequences of her own actions finally catching up to her. The next day, the courtroom was packed. News of the dramatic testimony had spread, attracting additional media attention and curious onlookers. I sat beside Susan, trying to control my racing heart as we waited for Judge Harrison to enter. James sat directly behind me, close enough that I could feel his reassuring presence. Miranda and Richard arrived moments before the proceedings began. Miranda had abandoned yesterday's vulnerable appearance for a power suit, as if armor against the coming judgment. Our parents slipped in just as the bailiff called the court to order, taking seats in the neutral middle ground of the gallery rather than behind either Miranda or me, a telling detail that didn't escape my notice. Judge Harrison entered, his expression giving away nothing as he settled behind the bench and arranged his papers. The courtroom fell silent, the tension almost palpable. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented in this case, he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hushed room. I am prepared to deliver my judgment in the matter of Chambers versus Reynolds. He looked directly at Miranda, his gaze unflinching. Mrs. Chambers has brought serious allegations against her sister, claiming a pattern of psychological abuse spanning decades and resulting in compensable emotional damage. The court has an obligation to take such claims seriously. Family relationships can indeed cause profound harm when they become toxic. My heart sank at these opening remarks, which seemed to validate Miranda's claims. Beside me, Susan remained calm, her expression revealing nothing. However, Judge Harrison continued, serious allegations require serious evidence. In this case, the evidence not only fails to support Mrs. Chambers' claims, but actively contradicts them. He methodically reviewed the key points from the trial: the lack of contemporaneous evidence for Miranda's allegations, the contradictory testimony from Dr. Cohen, the revelations about Miranda's statements regarding her true motivations. The stark contrast between my consistent care for our grandmother and Miranda's minimal involvement. What emerges from this evidence is not a picture of psychological abuse by the defendant, but rather a troubling pattern of manipulation and entitlement by the plaintiff, Judge Harrison stated, his tone growing stern. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a case where the evidence so thoroughly undermines a plaintiff's claims. He looked directly at Miranda again. Mrs. Chambers, this court finds your lawsuit to be frivolous, vindictive, and potentially fraudulent. Your attempt to monetize what appears to be normal sibling rivalry, in which you, by all accounts, held the advantaged position, represents an abuse of the legal system and a profound misunderstanding of what constitutes compensable emotional distress. Miranda's face had gone completely white, her lips pressed into a thin line as Judge Harrison continued his devastating assessment. Furthermore, the evidence suggests you pursued this lawsuit not because of any genuine harm suffered, but as retaliation for your grandmother's perfectly legal and rational decision to distribute her assets according to her own wishes. This court will not be used as an instrument for such revenge. He turned briefly toward my parents. I must also note my concern regarding the role Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds played in enabling this situation. Your testimony revealed a family dynamic that consistently privileged one child over another, a pattern that likely contributed to the resentments and conflicts that culminated in this lawsuit. My parents shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with either Miranda or me. Therefore, Judge Harrison concluded, this case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning Mrs. Chambers cannot refile these claims in the future. Additionally, given the frivolous nature of this lawsuit, the court orders the plaintiff to pay the defendant's reasonable legal fees in full. He paused, his expression severe. Let me be clear, this judgment is not simply about who wins or loses a family dispute. It is about the integrity of our legal system and the principle that courts exist to provide justice, not to facilitate personal vendettas. With a final tap of his gavel, Judge Harrison ended the proceedings. Court is adjourned. For a moment, the courtroom remained silent, as if collectively processing the decisiveness of the judgment. Then Miranda stood abruptly, her face contorted with rage. This is outrageous. I'll appeal. You haven't heard the last of this. Miranda, Richard murmured, trying to calm her, but she shook off his hand. Don't touch me, she snapped. You are supposed to win this case. What kind of lawyer are you? As Miranda's public meltdown continued, with court officers moving to intervene, Susan gathered our papers calmly. "Let's exit quietly," she advised. "The judgment speaks for itself. We don't need to add to the spectacle." Outside the courthouse, several reporters approached us for comment. Susan gave a brief, professional statement emphasizing my relief at the judgment and desire to move forward. I added only that I hoped our family could begin to heal from this painful chapter. Meanwhile, cameras captured Miranda's continued outburst as she stormed to their car, Richard trailing behind with an expression of growing disillusionment. The contrast between our composed exit and Miranda's tantrum became the focus of local news coverage, with one outlet running the headline, "Judge dismisses vindictive sibling lawsuit. Emotional damage claim backfires." In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the judgment spread through our lives in unexpected ways. Richard filed for divorce from Miranda less than a week after the trial, citing irreconcilable differences but privately telling mutual friends that the trial had revealed a side of his wife he could no longer ignore or excuse. My parents reached out tentatively, first through an awkwardly worded email expressing regret for any misunderstandings, then with a request to meet for coffee. When we finally sat across from each other at a neutral cafe, their discomfort was palpable. "We never meant to hurt you, Natalie," my mother began. "We always loved both our daughters equally. But you didn't treat us equally," I replied quietly. "And you are willing to testify against me based on Miranda's lies without ever asking for my side of the story." My father looked genuinely confused. "We believed Miranda because, well, she's always been so reliable, so successful." "You believed her because you've always believed her," I corrected. "Because from childhood, you decided she was the daughter worth investing in, and I was the afterthought." They didn't deny it, which was perhaps the most honest thing they'd done regarding our family dynamic in years. "We'd like to try to repair our relationship," my mother said after an uncomfortable silence. "You're our daughter, too." I took a deep breath, remembering the advice of my therapist, whom I'd started seeing again to process the trauma of the lawsuit. "I'm open to rebuilding a relationship," I told them carefully. "But it would need to be a new relationship based on who I actually am, not who you've assumed I am for 32 years. And it would require acknowledgement of the favoritism that shaped my childhood and led to this lawsuit." My parents exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with these terms, but unwilling to reject them outright. We parted with a tentative agreement to begin family therapy. A small step, but more than I had expected. Meanwhile, Miranda's professional reputation suffered significant damage. The local legal community is relatively small, and news of the judgment, particularly Judge Harrison's harsh assessment of her ethics, spread quickly. Several clients requested their cases be transferred to other attorneys at her firm, and partners began excluding her from high-profile cases. Her social standing took a similar hit. Friends who had initially sympathized with her family trauma gradually distanced themselves as the full story emerged. Her carefully curated image as a successful, put-together professional woman crumbled under the weight of her courthouse behavior and the revelations about her character. In contrast, my design business began to flourish in unexpected ways. The positive media attention highlighted my work, and several new clients specifically sought me out after reading about the case. One prominent local business owner told me, "Anyone who can handle that kind of pressure with the grace you showed has the kind of character I want to work with." James and I moved forward with wedding planning, opting for a small ceremony with chosen family rather than biological relatives. We decided to use part of Grandma Grace's inheritance as a down payment on a modest house with a studio space where I could expand my design business. Throughout this period, Miranda made several attempts to rehabilitate her image. She launched a social media campaign portraying herself as the victim of a miscarriage of justice, but the responses were overwhelmingly negative. An ill-advised television interview on a local morning show backfired when the host asked pointed questions about Dr. Cohen's testimony, causing Miranda to abruptly end the interview. Former friends and colleagues began sharing their own stories of Miranda's manipulative behavior over the years, creating a damning portrait that confirmed the judge's assessment. One law school classmate revealed how Miranda had sabotaged her internship application by accidentally deleting crucial files from her laptop. A former neighbor described Miranda as spreading rumors that had resulted in the neighbor's children being excluded from playdates. As these stories accumulated, I received unexpected messages of support from people who had experienced similar family dynamics, the golden child/scapegoat pattern that had defined my relationship with Miranda. Their words of encouragement and understanding helped heal wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged. Reading about your case was like reading about my own family, one message read. Thank you for standing up for yourself. It gives the rest of us courage. Throughout this tumultuous period, James remained my rock. You know what I find amazing, he said one evening as we sat on the porch of our new home, watching the sunset. Despite everything your family put you through, you've never become bitter or vengeful. You fought for justice, not revenge. I had a good example in Grandma Grace, I replied, thinking of her quiet dignity and refusal to play family politics. And I had you believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. As the dust began to settle, my parents made genuine, if awkward, attempts to understand their role in creating the family dynamic that had led to such destruction. After several family therapy sessions, my father made a breakthrough admission. I think we favored Miranda because she was more like us, ambitious, conventional, focused on external validation. You were different, Natalie, and we didn't know how to connect with or value those differences. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, an acknowledgement that the problem had never been me, but their inability to see beyond their narrow definition of success and worth. 6 months after the trial, as James and I finalized plans for our small wedding, news came that Miranda had been forced to downsize significantly following her divorce and career setbacks. She had sold her luxury home and moved to a modest apartment, a tangible symbol of how her fortunes had reversed. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a complicated mix of sadness for what our relationship could have been and relief that her power to harm me had been neutralized. The sister I had grown up with, the golden child who seemed untouchable in her perfection, had been revealed as deeply flawed and ultimately self-defeating in her pursuit of victory at any cost. Do you think you'll ever reconcile with Miranda? James asked as we sorted through potential wedding invitations. I considered the question carefully. I don't know. Reconciliation requires both parties to acknowledge the truth and work toward healing. Miranda hasn't shown any capacity for that kind of honesty or growth. Yet life has a way of surprising us, as I would soon discover when an unexpected visitor knocked on my studio door one rainy afternoon. 1 year after the trial that had torn apart what remained of my family, life had settled into a new and largely positive rhythm. My design studio, Grace Designs, named in honor of my grandmother, had expanded from a home office to a small commercial space in a trendy part of Portland. I had hired 2 part-time assistants to help manage the growing client list, many of whom had come to me after the publicity surrounding the trial. James and I had married in a simple ceremony at a botanical garden, surrounded by friends who had supported us through the darkest days of the lawsuit. My parents attended, still awkward but making visible efforts to build a healthier relationship. Miranda was not invited, and she made no attempt to contact me on the day. Our home, a charming bungalow with a converted garage that served as my initial studio space, had become the warm, welcoming environment I had always craved. We discussed starting a family of our own, both of us committed to breaking the toxic patterns that had defined my childhood. If we have children, they'll never question that they're equally loved, James said one evening as we discussed the possibility. No golden child, no scapegoat, just kids who are valued for exactly who they are. The inheritance from Grandma Grace had provided not just financial security, but a sense of validation. Confirmation that someone had seen my true worth when my immediate family couldn't or wouldn't. Beyond a down payment on our home and seed money for my expanded business, I had used part of the inheritance to establish a small scholarship fund in Grandma's name at the local community college, specifically for art students from disadvantaged backgrounds. My relationship with my parents had improved, though it remained a work in progress. Our family therapy sessions had revealed decades of unexamined assumptions and patterns, many of which traced back to my parents' own upbringings. My father, it turned out, had been the forgotten child in his family, while my mother had been raised with extreme pressure to achieve. They had unconsciously recreated these patterns with Miranda and me, channeling their own unresolved issues into the next generation. "We failed you," my father admitted during one particularly emotional session. "We were so focused on pushing Miranda to achieve what we thought represented success that we didn't see the damage we were doing to both of you." These revelations didn't erase the pain of my childhood, but they helped me understand it in a new context. Forgiveness became possible, not because they deserved it, but because it freed me from carrying the weight of resentment. News of Miranda came primarily through my parents or mutual acquaintances. Her divorce from Richard had been finalized with terms that, while not ruinous, were far less favorable than she had hoped. Her legal career had stalled, with partnership prospects at her firm effectively terminated after several major clients requested she not be assigned to their cases. She had moved from her luxury home to a two-bedroom condo in a less prestigious neighborhood and was, according to my mother, reassessing her priorities. I had no direct contact with my sister and had made peace with the likelihood that our relationship was permanently severed. Given the depth of her deception and the harm she had tried to inflict, reconciliation seemed not just unlikely, but potentially unwise. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March, as I was reviewing design proofs for a new client, my assistant Zoe knocked on my office door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression uncertain. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she says she's your sister."
My heart stuttered in my chest.
"Miranda's here?"
"Now."
Zoe nodded. "Should I tell her you're busy?" I considered the option, tempted to avoid what would surely be an uncomfortable encounter. But curiosity, and perhaps some residual hope that had survived against all odds, led me to shake my head. "It's okay. Send her in." The woman who entered my office was almost unrecognizable from the polished, confident Miranda I had faced in court a year earlier. Her hair, once immaculately styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore minimal makeup, and her clothing, while neat, lacked the designer labels and perfect tailoring that had been her uniform. But the most striking change was in her eyes. The hardness I had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something I couldn't immediately identify. "Hi, Natalie," she said, her voice lacking its usual assertive edge. "Thank you for seeing me. Would you like to sit down?" I offered, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She sat, her movements careful, as if she was navigating unfamiliar territory. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I waited, having learned through therapy that I didn't need to fill uncomfortable silences or take responsibility for others' emotions. "Your studio is beautiful," Miranda finally said, glancing around at the bright space with its exposed brick walls and large windows. "I saw the article about it in Portland Monthly. It said you're fully booked 3 months out." "Yes," I confirmed, not elaborating. "What brings you here, Miranda?" She took a deep breath. "I've been in intensive therapy for the past 8 months," she began. "Real therapy, not the kind where I told the therapist what to think. It's been difficult. Necessary, but difficult." I nodded but remained silent, unwilling to make this easier for her. "I've had to face some hard truths about myself," Miranda continued, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "About the kind of person I've been, the way I've treated people. Especially you." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I was jealous of you, Natalie. I always have been." Of all the things I had expected Miranda to say, this wasn't one of them. Jealous? Of me? That doesn't make sense. You had everything, the grades, the achievements, mom and dad's approval, the successful career. "I had external validation," Miranda corrected. "You had something I never did, the ability to be yourself without needing constant approval. You connected with Grandma Grace in a way I never could because you weren't performing for her. You were just present. Authentic." She glanced down at her hands. "And the more mom and dad favored me, the more I needed that favoritism to feel worthy. It became a prison of my own making. Every achievement just raised the bar for the next one. I was never enough. I remained silent, processing her words, searching for any sign of the manipulation that had characterized our previous interactions. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Miranda clarified, seeming to sense my skepticism. "What I did to you was unforgivable. The lawsuit, the lies, trying to destroy your reputation and business, there's no excuse for any of it." "Then what are you asking for?" I questioned, my voice measured. "Nothing really," she admitted. "I just needed to acknowledge the truth to your face." My therapist suggested writing a letter, but that felt cowardly after everything I put you through. She paused. "I am genuinely sorry, Natalie. Not just for the lawsuit, but for a lifetime of treating you as competition rather than as my sister." I studied her, searching for signs of the old Miranda, the calculated charm, the hidden agenda. But all I saw was exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "It will take more than an apology to rebuild trust," I said finally. "If that's even possible." "I know," she nodded. "I don't expect us to be close. I just—" She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "I didn't want you to spend your life thinking you had done something to deserve how I treated you. The problem was always me, not you." We sat in silence for a moment, the rain pattering against the windows providing a gentle soundtrack to this unexpected conversation. "How are Mom and Dad?" Miranda asked eventually. "We're working on building a healthier relationship," I replied. "Family therapy has helped. They're starting to see the patterns that led us here." Miranda nodded. "They've reached out to me too. I've been reluctant to engage because I'm still working through my own issues with them, the pressure, the expectations. But maybe someday." As our conversation continued, I maintained careful emotional boundaries while acknowledging the courage it must have taken for Miranda to come here. When she eventually rose to leave, I walked her to the door of my studio. "I don't know what the future holds for us as sisters," I told her honestly. "But I appreciate your coming here today." "Thank you for listening," she replied simply. At the doorway, she turned back. "The scholarship fund you created in Grandma's name, it's exactly what she would have wanted. She always saw the best in you, Natalie." She was right. After Miranda left, I sat in my office for a long time, processing the encounter. I didn't know if this was the beginning of reconciliation or simply a moment of closure. Either way, it represented something I hadn't expected, the possibility that even Miranda, who had seemed so irredeemably committed to her distorted view of our relationship, could change. In the months that followed, Miranda and I established cautious, limited contact. Coffee once a month, brief texts about neutral topics, a careful dance of rebuilding some form of relationship without expectation or pressure. The wounds were too deep for us to ever be the close sisters we might have been in some alternate reality where our parents had parented differently. But we found a way to coexist with mutual respect, if not intimate connection. I used part of Grandma Grace's inheritance to expand the scholarship fund, adding a mentorship component that paired recipients with working artists and designers. The first cohort of Grace Scholars included 5 talented young people who might otherwise have abandoned their creative pursuits due to financial constraints. At the inaugural scholarship ceremony, held in a small gallery downtown, I shared the story of Grandma Grace's influence on my life. How her belief in me had sustained me through years of feeling invisible in my own family. Sometimes, it only takes one person to see your true value for you to begin seeing it yourself, I told the recipients. My grandmother was that person for me. This scholarship is my way of paying that forward. Among the attendees was Judge Harrison, who had reached out after reading about the scholarship in the local paper. After the ceremony, he approached me with a warm smile. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "I've presided over thousands of cases in my career, but yours has stayed with me. It's gratifying to see something so positive emerge from such a difficult situation. Thank you for seeing the truth when it mattered," I replied, shaking his hand. "The truth has a way of making itself known," he observed. "But it takes courage to stand by it when everyone around you is committed to denying it." You showed remarkable strength throughout that ordeal." His words touched me deeply, an unexpected validation from someone who had witnessed one of the most painful chapters of my life. James and I welcomed our first child, a daughter named Grace, the following spring. Holding her in my arms, I made a silent promise that she would always know her worth was intrinsic, not tied to achievements or comparisons. My parents, making genuine efforts to be better grandparents than they had been parents, doted on her without the weighted expectations they had placed on Miranda and me. Miranda sent a thoughtful gift when Grace was born, a collection of children's books about strong, creative female characters, but maintained a respectful distance, understanding that trust would be built slowly, if at all. Life continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have imagined during the darkest days of Miranda's lawsuit. My business thrived, my marriage deepened, and my relationship with my parents slowly healed. The inheritance that had triggered such conflict ultimately became a foundation for building a life defined by my own values rather than others' expectations. On Grace's first birthday, I took her to visit Grandma Grace's grave, placing a small bouquet of lavender and roses, her favorites, against the headstone. "She would have adored you," I told my daughter as she played with a fallen leaf. "And she would have been so proud of the life we've built." As I sat there, with my daughter babbling happily beside me, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The path had been painful, filled with betrayal and heartache I wouldn't wish on anyone. Yet without those challenges, I might never have found the strength to break free from the limiting roles assigned to me by my family. In the end, Miranda's attempt to punish me had instead liberated me. By forcing our family's dysfunction into the harsh light of a courtroom, she had inadvertently created the circumstances for truth and healing. The inheritance that she had so desperately wanted had transformed my life, not primarily through financial security, but by validating my worth when I needed it most. Karma, it seemed, worked in unexpected ways. Not as punishment or reward, but as a natural unfolding of consequences that ultimately served everyone's highest good, even when the path there was painful. As Grace and I prepared to leave the cemetery, I placed my hand on Grandma's headstone one final time. "Thank you," I whispered, "for all she had given me. Not just material inheritance, but the far more valuable legacy of knowing I was seen, valued, and loved for exactly who I was." Have you ever experienced family betrayal that eventually led to unexpected growth or freedom? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most painful experiences become our greatest teachers, as they were for me. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to hear more reflections on family dynamics, healing, and personal growth. Your support means the world to me, and your experiences might help someone else feel less alone in their family struggles. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May we all find the strength to stand in our truth, even when those closest to us try to deny it.